The end. Words that many have come to associate with fear, not out of the longing experienced when parting with a work of art that truly touched you, a longing marked by a void-like emotion that wreathes you and feels impossible to fill with anything else, but rather a type of fear that emerges from a trauma response, like an old wound that aches at the coming of inclement weather, a fear born of experience, a pain that aches with the memories of an ending blown, fumbled at the end zone, a defeat pulled from the jaws of victory. When something comes to an end, people don't get excited anymore. They get worried, and then they get mad. Oh man, Jesus. On October 13th, 2023, Glitch Productions and Gooseworks released an animated pilot for the show The Amazing Digital Circus. It did okay. Over the course of 3 years, 8 total episodes were produced. As of right now, the total view count of the series sits around 1 billion views on YouTube alone. This level of popularity from a YouTube indie production was, at the time, completely unheard of. To put this level of popularity into perspective, a survey polled by Smith Geiger with assistance from Google tabulated that people from ages 14 to 24 had a 1 in 4 chance of even hearing about the show. That kind of cultural saturation is often reserved for media juggernauts like Marvel, and yet this tiny indie studio had managed to capture the attention of a massive swath of the population. But Glitch, the animation studio who produced the show, was not interested in keeping it going indefinitely. The studio is best known for making very limited series, with Digital Circus being no different in that regard. Additionally, the creative minds behind the show, the artist known as Gooseworks, was steadfast in the idea that despite the generational levels of popularity the show had acquired, that it would end with the 9th and final episode. And this is a good thing. Art that has a clear idea of where it wants to finish is how some of the best creative works ever made were conceived. Full Metal Alchemist, Mr. Robot, The Good Place, all shows that knew how long they wanted to be from the very start and didn't overstay their welcome when they got there. Many of these shows left me wanting more, but ultimately I was glad that they ended on their own terms. So why then did the lead up to the premiere of the final episode of The Amazing Digital Circus make me feel this sense of creeping dread? The show up to this point has been nothing but excellent. The writing, the characters, the jokes. So what made me feel this way? And then I remembered May 19th, 2019. Sitting on my couch, staring at an end screen of the final episode of Game of Thrones. Nearly 10 years, all of my adult life, spent watching one of the most consistently engaging pieces of art that I have ever seen put to television sputter out in one of the most embarrassing season finales I have ever seen. Every drop of my emotional energy had been spent agonizing over the lead up to this absolute shitter of a finale. I'll put some cultural context, as it happened almost 8 years ago and broadly started over 15 years ago. Game of Thrones was a phenomenon in a way that doesn't really happen anymore with television. You see, the early 2000s were the last real moment in culture which was shared by everyone. Dubbed the monoculture, you could go up to any random person walking down the street and ask them about some particular pop culture factoid, and most of the time, they would at least be aware of what you were talking about. And if you asked this hypothetical person about Game of Thrones, they would know what you were talking about. Up to that point in TV, there was a hard limit with what you could do. Certain genres of stories simply could not be done with the limits of budget that television provided. One such genre was fantasy. If a fantasy show was commissioned by a larger network, it would often be constrained in scope, forced to reuse assets, locations, and generally stretch every dime they had. As popular of a genre fantasy was, it had yet to catch on with TV audiences in a major way. TV audiences had yet to fall in love with it that was necessary to fund shows that could do swords and sorcery justice. And adapting a large-scale fantasy book? Just forget about it. Then HBO comes in with a big sack full of cash and hands it over to D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, and they make Game of Thrones and knock the wind out of everyone in the industry. The show had a massive cast, gorgeous production design, CGI that somehow looked really good for TV, and writing that embarrassed most other shows at the time. Turns out all you needed to do fantasy TV to break into the mainstream was just the right gumption and shit tons of money. As each episode of Game of Thrones cost HBO $6 million, an unheard of expenditure for a show at the time. For reference, shows like The Wire and Sopranos cost HBO $1.5 and $3 million per episode respectively. Each episode of the final season of Sopranos saw its cost rise to the same level of Game of Thrones, but that was due to the cast being paid more rather than the scope of the project increasing. But even then, it only ever got to $6 million per episode, where Game of Thrones started at $6 million, which is absolutely crazy. But if any show could look like $6 million bucks, it was Game of Thrones. Every week, it was like HBO was putting on a fully feature-length fantasy epic, hour-long episodes with fantastic pacing, split between 4 different locations with different sets of characters, working towards complex political goals, as well as interpersonal drama between them. And it was really violent. Like, holy shit. Game of Thrones was coming out in a time in which violence in movies and sex on TV generally was being toned down over the course of the decade, aiming for a more PG-13 demographic as to appease the more prudish advertisers. Then Game of Thrones comes in and upends that as well. The level of gratuity found in the show was something that had never really been done before on TV, and it was in a fantasy epic, no less. You have to understand, the popular conception of fantasy at that time was Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was violent, sure, but most of the violence was reserved for orcs and goblins, which fantasy fans of all kinds collectively agree don't count.
You real tough bullying a kid.
But Game of Thrones did not reserve its violence for green human-shaped blood pinatas, but instead dished it out to, well, literally anyone it felt like. Character death in the show became something it was well known for. Well-liked characters with stories that felt like they were going to go somewhere would be brutalized in an incredibly sudden display of violence. It made the show feel scary, like you didn't know who was safe at any given moment. Once the end of season 1 hit, and good old Ned lost his head, it became very clear that nobody was safe. For 2.5-month periods, every year for 6 years, the show would put out an episode every Sunday. A rapid pace by today's standards, with the same great writing, acting, and production quality. And in many people's opinions, and mine, the show got considerably better as time went on. For a considerable period of time, fans of the show thought the weakest season was the first one. You know, the season that jettisoned it into popular culture. And this isn't even to say that the fans thought that the first season was bad. Not at all. Season 1 is still considered to be some of the best TV ever produced. But compared to the next 3 seasons, the first looked like amateur hour. Seasons 2 through 4 featured more characters, battles, sieges, dragons, and plot twists. It felt like the show couldn't be stopped. The momentum was incredible. The show felt like it was building to a massive finale as it planted seeds of dragon queens conquering Westeros and ice zombie apocalypses, and the elevation of a fan-favorite character to the status of a mythic hero. It did stumble a bit at the 5th season. Some poor writing took place. People got a little worried, but it recovered by season 6. Just some growing pains as the series moved towards its big finale. The building excitement for the resolution of years of plot lines had reached a fever pitch. We had no idea what was coming. A lot of what made Game of Thrones so great was its source material, a fantasy series called A Song of Ice and Fire by renowned author George R.R. Martin, with the first book published in 1996. The books were masterfully crafted works of literature, and the lengths of each book rivaled that of the whole of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The word counts of Sword of Storms and individually exceeded Tolkien's collective epics. When the first episode of Game of Thrones was released in 2011, Weiss and Benioff had 1.7 million words spread across 5 books to work with. The expectation was that by the time they had finished adapting all of the current books, Martin would have the next book out the door. and be partway through the final novel. With this in mind, the show plowed through the material, trimming the fat here and there to keep a healthy pace with narrative progression. And when they came to the end of the 6th season, they reached for the winds of winter, and George hadn't finished it. Now, the show's writing team was nothing to sneeze at. Adapting books for the small screen isn't as simple as handing the actors copies of their script directly pulled from the text and say, read it out loud. You have to alter the text to fit the medium, and a lot of the show's greatness was found within the ability of the writing staff to weave the source material into this new form. A lot was cut from the books, some highly controversial cuts, in fact, like the exclusion of the character Lady Stoneheart, but many of the best moments of the show were wholly new additions. Much of the relationship between Arya and the Hound was concocted specifically for this adaptation, as were the scenes where Arya posed as a servant girl for Tywin Lannister. A lot of Arya additions were especially good for some reason. I don't know. She didn't really have a lot to work with in the books themselves, it doesn't matter. So the writing team has talent, and with that talent, surely they could pull off the ending without a book with some notes from George, right?
Wrong!
Well, not to bury the lead too much here, but no. It was a trash fire. Characters suddenly start acting in direct contradiction to their established development from previous seasons. The weight of the physical distance the show had, where characters would spend significant parts of some seasons simply getting from point A to point B, became truncated in an incredibly jarring way, where characters would seemingly teleport from one side of the continent to the other. Major arcs with world-shaking implications that had been set up for nearly a decade would be resolved in single episodes. For example, the ice zombie apocalypse. I mentioned it before, which had its plot established in the very first scene of the entire show, ended in a single episode. It was unbelievably anticlimactic. But how is that even possible? Well, remember when I mentioned the cost of a single episode of The Sopranos ballooning out from a measly few million in the early seasons to later being just as much as Game of Thrones was at its very beginning? Well, that also happened to Game of Thrones. And while I love James Gandolfini, the cost of keeping the stars created by Game of Thrones would prove to be a lot more expensive than The Sopranos. Names like Peter Dinklage, Emily Clarke, and Jason Momoa were considered to be relative unknowns before they became superstars due to the fame provided by the show. And with fame comes cost. It's honestly kind of funny how the show suffered from its own success in this way. By turning so many of its stars into household names, it ended up expanding the cost considerably. And while many shows manage by only having a handful of core cast members, Game of Thrones' large ensemble cast meant that as the show progressed, they had to pay even more people. And even with the show's propensity for killing people off, it did little to help prune the amount of characters they had to deal with. And by the final season, the show's per episode budget had nearly tripled from $6 million to $15 million per episode. This caused the last season to just have 6 episodes, compared to the 10 episodes received by most of the seasons before. This truncated screen time, paired with a massive cast of characters, all with their own unresolved story arcs, made the last 2 seasons feel incredibly rushed. And with no source material to fall back on, and the strain of shorter seasons, the writing fractured under the pressure. After the finale dropped, the fan base fell to infighting. People trying to find some silver lining in the show's lackluster end were pitted against those so completely saturated with vitriol and snark that it was just inevitably going to be a bloodbath. Both were coping with the situation that should not have even happened, and the discord echoed across the internet. The mighty oak that was Game of Thrones crashing to the forest floor could be heard near and far, and it felt like the end of an era. One of the last big tentpole shows collapsing under its own weight, and everyone was fucking mad. You have to understand, Game of Thrones was so good for so long that the idea of its resolution being anything other than excellent was unthinkable. Even in the throes of season 7, the people still held out hope that the show would course correct, like it did after season 5. So when the axe fell, nobody really saw it coming. the worst part was the betrayal of the thing. When you get invested in the story as deeply as you did with Thrones, you give yourself over to it, in part. For most works of art, this kind of sucker punch simply never happens. Books, movies, games, they all come out as completed packages, and doing a little bit of research before diving in tends to show the warning signs of media that might disappoint. But for serialized works, where there's a good chance you'll experience something as it's coming out, meaning you'll be exposed to the possibility of a good thing going rancid before you even realize what's happening. And when it happens, it wounds you. After Game of Thrones, nothing was the same. Endings felt like landmines for many, myself included, and the act of experiencing art that had yet to be completed felt dangerous in the same way that, I don't know, sipping coffee before it fully cools is dangerous. So not really at all, but fuck you, it's my video, I can be overdramatic if I want to. People became more jaded, ready to rip endings apart at the slightest sign that they might disappoint. Because if something sucked, you couldn't get hurt by it if you spurned the art before it spurned you. Whenever a series neared its conclusion, there would be an upwelling of anxiety, like the feeling that one gets before going to the dentist. Even if you flossed every day and brushed your teeth after every meal, you can't help but feel that the dentist is going to take one look at your gaping maw and say, root canal, no anesthesia. Not because it's reasonable to expect that outcome, but rather that the idea of a dentist has become so mythologized in the realms of pain and discomfort, but one can't help but instill with that deep, cold dread when going to one. It's the same for the ending of Game of Thrones. Even if you've never watched the show, it's easy to get swept up in the rampant doomsaying for any given series because nobody wants to be caught with their pants down when something turns out to suck. Which brings us right back to the finale of the Amazing Digital Circus. The last episode was given a theatrical release, as opposed to just being posted onto Glitch Productions' YouTube page. This theatrical run would be relatively limited. Some people wouldn't be able to go see it due to the availability in their particular area, or simply not have the spare dough to spend on going to a theater. Such is life nowadays. The gap between the beginning of its run on the big screen and its eventual drop on YouTube was about 2 weeks. This had the unintended effect of creating subgroups within the fanbase, based on who could see the episode in theaters early and those who could not. This caused 2 problems. Firstly, those who couldn't make it to the theater were basically shit out of luck. People naturally had strong feelings about this. Going from a freely available web-based show to one that now must be watched in public for money was something that was always going to rub people the wrong way. Now, artists getting paid for their hard work is something that I strongly believe in. I fully understand the desire of Glitch and the rest of the Amazing Digital Circus team to get the bag, so to speak. And they did, as the theatrical run netted a box office of $36 million. But at the same time, a lot of those who pushed the show to the level of popularity were young people, most of whom are broke as fuck. It's hard to justify going out in this current hell world we live in, even if we love the art that we'd be supporting. And you might say, it's not a big deal, you can just wait for the episode to come out. It's only like 2 weeks of waiting, you'll live. Which would be true, if not for the second problem, spoiler culture. The Amazing Digital Circus was always something of a communal viewing experience for its fans, something that could be watched and discussed together, sharing theories and new in-jokes among the various internet watering holes that people would frequent. So when it was announced that the final episode would be paywalled for a limited time, it raised immediate concerns over the ability of many of its fans to engage with the community's activities until they could make a pilgrimage to some fuck-ass movie theater to watch the damn thing. If they didn't, they'd be functionally barred from the community that had been built under the assumption that everyone on the internet could freely experience the media that they had come to love and share. Which is kind of fucked, honestly. There's a serious discussion to be had about the ethics of building a community off something free only to suddenly paywall that same content, especially when a significant amount of the enjoyment is derived from being on the ground floor when it comes out to discuss it with other community members. From my personal experience, seeing the discussion of the finale while it was still in theaters was really weird. Everyone who had gotten the chance to go and see it had to bite their tongues and not spoil the show for those who hadn't, or had to sequester themselves away to quarantined boards just to speak openly about their thoughts. For everyone else, it was like walking through a minefield of spoilers, half reading vague posts as to not glean anything that would let you divine the outcome of the final episode, and oftentimes just staying off the internet just to not see anything that would give up any information. Generally, people were shockingly well behaved about all of it. I didn't get spoiled, and I didn't really have to try that hard, but for many, the threat of spoilers mixed with the general feelings of the discussions left people in a state of arrested development, made the experience uncomfortable. And all the while, there was that feeling bubbling at the back of the throat of the community, a disquiet, that there was something wrong with the ending. Many of the discussions that came from the final episode had this undercurrent of dissatisfaction that leaked into the rest of the community. This in spite of the fact that there was a considerable amount of moderation, tone policing, and self-restraint for the benefit of those who had yet to see it. This was an occurrence common to the many fandoms post-Game of Thrones. There was a serialized piece of media entering its final stretch, and the community surrounding it was awash with a malaise of restlessness, this unshakable feeling that they were unwitting audiences to a fuse slowly burning down to a dud fireworks show, and all they would be left staring at is a blank sky awash with black. You saw this a lot in manga, weirdly enough. Long-running series like Jujutsu Kaisen, My Hero Academia, and Attack on Titan all had endings that were divisive to some extent, and had their communities fall into some level of infighting. Many of these endings would fall victim to, unfortunately, very funny memes with how lackluster they were. For those in the know, you might remember a series of jokes about the main character of My Hero Academia, Midoriya, working at a McDonald's and being told to put the fries in the bag after the resolution of the story. To a degree, these endings were overshadowed by the responses the internet had to them, to the point in which the quality of the endings mattered less than their perceived efficacy at satisfying their fan bases. I read Jujutsu Kaisen. The ending was fine. It didn't blow your mind or anything, but it succeeded at doing what it set out to do. Some people were underwhelmed with the outcome it provided, but none of the issues found within the ending were unique to the ending itself, and could be found throughout the entirety of the manga. To some degree, this can be stated for Attack on Titan and My Hero Academia as well. Not perfect endings, but not nearly as bad as they were portrayed by popular culture. This phenomenon was something that only started really appearing post-Game of Thrones. The endings of these shows became a tentpole for the type of discussion that worked under the assumption that they would inevitably disappoint unless they were unquestionably spectacular. This response, I believe, is due to the cultural impact of Game of Thrones' ending, and the way that it traumatized the people who watched it and informed the discussions for people who might not have seen it, but still experienced it through cultural osmosis. The changes it precipitated favored responses that were heavily critical, regardless of the quality of the series, because bad endings were a nesting ground for loud, burgeoning, virally inclined posting. This type of positive social media reinforcement fed into a culture of popular negativity, to the point in which every single publicly known serialized piece of media that came to an end after Game of Thrones flew to pieces as it pulled into the station would be treated as if it was also flying apart as it pulled into the station, regardless of whatever quality it had. Only the most beautifully, perfectly crafted endings would be spared this treatment, or art that was not popular enough to be fed into the viral negativity meat grinder. So this little animated indie series, which exploded in popularity and garnered 1 billion views on YouTube alone, had no hope of avoiding being pilloried by its own audience for the crimes of simply coming to an end. So how did it end? If you haven't seen it, somehow, go watch it. There's a link in the description. It's free. It came free with your Xbox. But for the sake of reminding you, the basic premise of the show is that there is this amazing digital circus. A number of Scrimblows are trapped there, including our protagonist, Pomni, who suddenly pops into existence in this 1998 digital chat room looking ass place. The show's immediate hooks are that none of the characters seem to know how they got there, why they're there, or what it even is. All the while, the entire virtual experience is being conducted by a slightly crazy AI named Kane, who takes Pomni and the rest of the ensemble cast of colorful characters on adventures in the digital world. It's funny. It's also incredibly disconcerting when you think about it, being trapped in a digital environment with no context as to what's going on, or even the ability to remember your own name, which none of the characters can. It lends to the series a silent terror, which you can't help but shake the feeling that something very bad is going to happen to these characters. The structure of the story is also very clearly inspired by the masterpiece short story I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison, in which a supercomputer, Am, traps a number of humans to be tortured forever after murder killing the rest of the world. The Amazing Digital Circus, in this way, is kind of a twisted reflection of this story. Instead of a murderous, torturous, evil AI, we have a confused, and for the most part, harmless version of the same type of character trying and failing to entertain what one must imagine are a bunch of very bored people. An interesting part of this is that despite the glossy, vibrant digital veneer the circus has, it doesn't do much to curtail the terror of being trapped in it. It instills this uncomfortable, almost uncanny valley feeling, or perhaps a liminal quality. After all, the sheer size of the circus is massive compared to the 6 or so inhabitants that live there. The core plot of the show can be broken down into 3 distinct pillars. The first being the larger questions about what the circus even is, its origins, and why all these people are now stuck in it, as well as the true nature of Kane. The second pillar is the immediate needs and desires of the trapped inhabitants. Much of the show's runtime is dedicated to how the cast copes with their new reality and how they try to forge new life in this digital world, while also dealing with Kane's antics. The third pillar is the interpersonal drama between these characters, specifically the drama that happened well before Pomni, our point of view character, even arrived at the circus, mostly revolving around Jax. Jax, at first blush, appears to be the show's comic relief, cracking jokes and doing all sorts of goofs and gaffes. But much of this behavior comes off as incredibly callous in the face of the despair that most of the cast experience, oftentimes making jokes at their expense for his own amusement. Jax is a huge asshole, and apparently there's a history there. Throughout the series, these 3 core plot lines are explored, but one becomes more and more predominant as the show progresses. While the show continually seeks to illustrate how each of the main cast copes with their imprisonment and meaningfully tackles the idea of never leaving, as well as the traumas from their lives in the outside world, the amount of elaboration and investigation as to what the circus is and who made it is kept rather vague and open to speculation. Only a scant few episodes meaningfully answer even the most basic questions as to the origin of this digital hell. And those answers usually come only to serve the other pillars of the narrative. The Amazing Digital Circus seems completely disinterested in the lore, so to speak, and chooses to spend its runtime on characters instead. I find this decision refreshing from a narrative standpoint. Many stories often get lost in the weeds of answering every possible question the audience might have, which leads to the really important thing, the characters, buried under a sea of exposition. The digital prison is not important past its utility as a narrative device to be used on the characters trapped within it. It's interesting, to be sure, but it can't be the primary plot of the show, and due to the limited nature of the series, it isn't really reasonable for it to be thoroughly explored without getting in the way of the actual plot. And we discover that the second and third pillars of the show's narrative are intrinsically linked. The emotional struggles that characters face in Jack's dark past start to crash into one another in ways that force us to focus our attention on exactly what happened before Pomni arrived at the circus. For anyone paying attention to the direction the show was going, it was incredibly obvious that the finale was going to be mostly about Jax. Of the questions that were left unanswered by the show, Jax's backstory was the thread that dangled the lowest and tangled up in pretty much every other character's arc, meaning that if anything was going to be resolved, it was going to have to include what made Jax's personality so openly cruel. You see, Jax, by the end of the show, had become something of a deuteragonist to Pomni. Pomni being optimistic, caring, and most importantly, honest with her emotions, Jax, conversely, seemed so scared to form any kind of emotional connection with the other characters to the point of being openly hostile to friendship that the rest of the cast either feared or hated him. Jax's reasonings for why he acted like this felt shallow and easily defeated, which Pomni did over and over again. This resulted in quite upsetting blow-ups between the two of them. Watching Jax become friends with Pomni only to self-sabotage repeatedly was genuinely incredibly sad. And the final would answer the question as to why it was like that. And people, as you might expect, got mad. Long story short, Jax is trans. This isn't directly stated, but it's heavily alluded to in the show, and Gooseworks has stated that this is the truth on Twitter. I know that's not necessarily the best way that information should be derived from media, but it's true. Jax drove a close friend to sewer slide. I don't know if I can say that word on YouTube. I'll censor it probably. I'll censor. I don't know. I haven't gotten demonetized yet. I don't want to start today, or whatever the equivalent to that is in the digital world. After revealing the most vulnerable parts of her past to said friend, Jax had been living in the shadow of that mistake for an indeterminate amount of time, and spent much of that time pushing everyone else away, until the final revealed that everyone was, in fact, a bunch of brain scans, and she abstracts off-screen. Much of this is revealed when Pomni makes contact with Jax's digital ghost in a gut-wrenching flashback. It's raw, like straight up upsetting stuff. After that sequence, Kane tells the surviving cast what their real selves are up to out in the real world after they were uploaded to the circus. The cast then resolves to make the best of the situation they have and live peacefully in the circus with each other. It's bittersweet and doesn't answer every question that you may have had, but it's good. It's emotionally complex and narratively satisfying in ways that simply explaining the origins of the company that led to Kane's creation, or of the circus as a whole, could have ever been. But like I mentioned before, any cracks in the ending that invites the weeds of discourse will take hold quickly. Whether it was a lack of exposition of the lore or too much of a focus on Jax, a subset of the community was not happy. And when that negativity breached containment, it would flow everywhere. Subreddits with nothing to do with the Amazing Digital Circus would be inundated with posts about the ending, and what almost always followed was the kind of discourse indicative of a post-Game of Thrones world. It wasn't perfect, so it must be bad. And this isn't for me to say that the ending was perfect. There are plenty of valid criticisms to be made about how certain characters got sidelined, in all likelihood due to time constraints, but many of those criticisms felt pretty mild compared to what the ending managed to accomplish, given the very limited run of only 8 30-minute episodes and 1 hour-long finale. I also need to point out that some of the hate of the ending was coming from the position that Jax being trans was a bad thing, or somehow it didn't make sense for her to be trans, or that it was too on the nose, or that it, conversely, was not clear enough. Which is all fucking bullshit, by the way. Jax being trans is probably the single most interesting thing about her character, and she has a lot of very interesting things about her character, so that says quite a bit. The ending wasn't bad. I'd even dare to say that it was pretty good. But most of the momentum of discourse and the propensity to lean heavily into negativity with no willingness to be just whelmed by an ending left the end of the Amazing Digital Circus to feel bitter. We live in an age of popular media in which the most acceptable default state is hostility, where the act of being optimistic is seen as foolish, and to be open to the idea that art can be trusted to do what it's going to do and end the way that it wants to is a path leading only to disappointment. I did not enjoy being let down so monumentally by Game of Thrones. It was agonizing to see something I love so dearly die right in front of my eyes, but I can't let that control my ability to enjoy art. It's not a healthy way to go about living, is what I would have said if it didn't happen again. This video is about Chainsaw Man. In 2016, I read the first chapter of Fire Punch. It had been posted in the r/manga subreddit in a scanlated format, meaning that someone bought it in its raw Japanese form and scanned it and translated it. It was really weird and kind of upsetting, a nude man on fire wandering through an apocalyptic winter hellscape. I didn't read much farther than a handful of chapters, but I didn't altogether hate it. Its rough art style and very economic use of language made it a breezy read, the incredibly dark world notwithstanding. And what made it even more interesting is who authored it. The 22-year-old Tatsuki Fujimoto. I would memory hole Fire Punch, as I wasn't in the right headspace for something as bleak as the world it depicted. I also didn't really want to read something weekly, as the agony of waiting for such bite-sized chapters, only 16 or so pages each, was kind of a torture. A torture I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. As I moved on to other things, Fire Punch would occasionally pop into my feed with people praising its art and writing and speaking to the cruelty of its world building. I was interested, but something about it just didn't speak to me. It was missing something. Then, in 2018, I saw a different manga, also posted to the same subreddit and penned once again by Tatsuki Fujimoto. But this was different. Whereas Fire Punch was a plucky first try at serialized work, this new manga was published into the premier manga magazine of Japan, Weekly Shonen Jump, home to the likes of One Piece and formerly Dragon Ball. Its name was Chainsaw Man, and it fucking ripped. The premise was simple. Boy meets dog. Dog is a chainsaw. Boy uses chainsaw dog to kill devils to sell to the organ-harvesting Yakuza, who he owes a massive debt, which he inherited from his father. Then they kill the boy and the dog anyway. But then his chainsaw dog fuses with him so he can become the Chainsaw Man. Hijinks ensue. If it sounds stupid, it is. But with that rough, sketchy art style and the overwhelming feeling of bleakness inherited from Fujimoto's previous works, it somehow melds together into something that works. It combines arcs with a mix of macabre with absurd, the tragic with triumphant, with a world so incredibly interesting and yet explained in so few words. It's a world basically the same as ours, granted in the early 90s, with the only apparent difference being that devils and the reality warping powers they possess are suffused into modern society. Their entire careers based on killing devils and selling their parts, government agencies dealing with devils for the public's benefit, devil contracts, half-devils, and the main character, the Chainsaw Man, Denji, caught in its flow. What makes the manga really work so well is Denji himself, who is, on the surface, an almost comically one-dimensional, sex-obsessed teenager with no family or education. He's lived most of his life in a shack with barely enough food to eat. He basically has no social skills. His drives are simple. His dreams are laughably easy to achieve. He's pathetic. But what else could he really be? Realistically, Denji's life has been so shit up to this point that even eating a good meal every day would be enough to constitute heaven on earth for him. And watching him become, for the lack of a better word, an actual person, endears us to him in a way that I would have never thought possible. Much of the cast is built the same way. They initially appear as caricatures or tropes, or seem to be downright jokes with no internality as people, only for every single one of them to reveal themselves to be emotionally complex, fully realized people. And then they start getting killed. The world, unfortunately for us, does not get nicer with the development of these characters. In fact, the series ramps up, the danger increases by a few orders of magnitude. People you would expect to stick around for the long run are unceremoniously cut in often brutal displays of violence. The manga seems to know with surgical precision when you, the reader, care the most about a character just to snip their threads. It's harrowing, but incredibly engaging. You want Denji to finally find peace, to be free of this maelstrom of suffering, and incredibly enough, it stuck the landing. Chainsaw Man's ending is a masterclass on how to properly tie up every loose end with incredible efficiency. It resolves every single character arc and answers enough questions to leave the reader satisfied, while also still leaving enough material for people to theorize on. It's not a happy ending, but it doesn't feel completely without hope. Denji finds his peace, and best of all, it leaves off in such a way for a continuation of the story if Fujimoto wanted to make one. In fact, it promises a part 2. Sad that it never ended up happening. You should go read Chainsaw Man. Stop after the end of part 1. Those other chapters you see are hallucinations. Do not watch any more of this video either. Like and subscribe and stuff like that, but past this point, you'll find nothing but one man's pain. It's not a place of honor, the rest of this video. Still here? Well, I warned you. Part 2 began publication about a year and a half after Part 1 ended. In the interceding time, Fujimoto penned 2 one-shots, one being Look Back, a semi-biographical tale about growing up with the fire of artistic passion and sharing that passion with another, and the loss of both of those things. It got a film adaptation somewhat recently, and you should go watch that. It proves Fujimoto isn't just some one-trick pony. The man possesses an understanding of drama and character that many mangaka could only dream of. The second one-shot, Goodbye Eerie, attempts to translate the filmic framing into its paneling while exploring the ideas of loss and finality. Goodbye Eerie also has a more meta discussion about endings and how difficult it is to get them right, with the main character, an aspiring filmmaker, choosing to just end his incredibly emotional movies with big explosions for no real reason. This makes for jarring endings that result in said films being heavily criticized. A one-shot about loss of the artistic passion, and another about choosing to just light an ending on fire instead of properly resolving it. Interesting. Foreshadowing is a narrative device. The publication of Chainsaw Man resumed, and with it, we met a new protagonist. Instead of the swift return of Denji, we are instead introduced to Asa, a high school girl living in the devil-infested world that we just experienced through the very skewed perspective of Denji. Right out the gate, Fujimoto establishes Asa as an incredibly emotionally complex, fully fleshed out individual with opinions, goals, and flaws. Very different from how Denji was established as a very simple character that grew in complexity over the course of the series. Asa is a fully formed protagonist from the jump. And then she gets murdered, and is thankfully resurrected by the power of a devil who offers her her life back in exchange for sharing a spot in her brain. This devil, the War Devil, would come to name herself Yoru, and she has a bone to pick with our original protagonist, the Chainsaw Man. A little bit of context, Denji at some point in the previous part gained the ability to erase concepts by eating their respective devil. The devils in this setting are representations of how much humans fear particular concepts. The devils grow stronger in accordance to how much fear people feel towards those concepts. So the chicken devil will be very weak, and the darkness devil will be impossibly strong. I'm not going to go into detail into how Denji acquired this power, just know that it exists, and he can do it to some degree. I mostly choose not to spoil this because if you're still watching and you haven't read part 1, you can still go back and read it without me having spoiled it completely, for the most part. Yoru, the War Devil, has become significantly weakened by the erasure of concepts like nuclear bombs, which were consumed by the same power that Denji now possesses. And she seeks to find him and get him to literally vomit them back up. This puts our protagonists, Asa and Denji, on a collision course with each other, likely to result in some sort of violent conflict. This quickly establishes the stakes the second part wanted to roll with, putting Denji, who has yet to even appear in this part, into immediate danger, while simultaneously endangering this new protagonist. And for multiple chapters, the manga shows incredible restraint by not giving us what we want, that is, having these two characters meet. Instead, it spends that time establishing Asa and Yoru's relationship. It fleshes out the surrounding world that had only been touched upon in the first part with Denji. And when Denji does show up, it's given the requisite bombast that one would expect with the protagonist of a functionally complete manga reappearing in a new story. Everything is going fucking great. And it's about as funny as you can possibly imagine. Asa being a neurotic, introverted, awkward girl failure, and Denji still in many ways is a sex-obsessed, shallow, albeit slightly more mature person than he was in the first part of the manga. Their personalities clash with each other in such spectacular ways, with one being hyper-focused, secretive, and generally kind of skittish, and the other being a fucking moron. Through a very large portion of part 2, neither Denji or Asa know who each other really are. They interact under the pretense that they are normal human beings, while in reality, they are, in fact, destined to be mortal enemies, simply due to the machinations of the other personality stuck in Asa's head. And naturally, building up from the first part where Denji is, at every turn, seeking to satisfy a deep-seated loneliness, meeting someone just as messed up as him, who's also kind of being manipulated in a very similar way, inevitably leads to one of the first non-problematic romances this manga ever gets to see. It's got everything. Intrigue, secrecy, a love story, and it's so fucking good. But around the fringes, where Fujimoto would normally fill an ensemble of interesting side characters which would be fully developed and fleshed out to add seasoning to this full course meal, we get a considerable amount of characters that show up and just kind of, I don't know, don't do anything. Which is odd, because every time Fujimoto would introduce a new character in any of his other works, they would serve specific purposes to enhance either the tone, the world, or reinforce the emotional states of the protagonists. In Part 2, there are scant few examples of this occurring. In Part 1, we would have characters like Aki or Power existing in conjunction with Denji to support his development into a fully fledged human being. Or we would have a menagerie of side characters to flesh out the world in meaningful ways. But in Part 2, all the side characters introduced feel like glorified set dressing. Barely any side characters in the second part do anything of real significance. They show up to have a hype moment, perhaps aura farm a bit, but never meaningfully progress the narrative in ways that make a great deal of sense in the same way that the characters in Part 1 did. There's no Rize or Makima or Kishibe to serve as a catalyst for the progression of character growth or plot progression or world building. Some characters attempt to do something like this in Part 2, but are mostly stymied by the lack of a good follow-through. As the end of Part 2 encroached, which I might add went on for an additional 2 years longer than Part 1 did, there was an entire cavalcade of characters which had very little impact on the overall story. They would show up for a handful of chapters, do some wacky bullshit, and would oftentimes be fridged, not even killed in a violent or insane way, just disappear for multiple months at a time. It would make the experience of reading Part 2 week to week disorienting and a scattered experience, where plot lines were simply left dangling, never to be truly resolved in a satisfying way until significantly later in the story, where many characters, plot elements, and stories simply resolved in blunt and unsatisfying ways. It was weird, and on top of all of that, the art suffered as well. Fujimoto was known for his more sketchy art style, having rougher gesture to allow the illustrations to convey the rawness that paired well with the style of narrative that Chainsaw Man sought to portray. But halfway through the new part, the art quality began to fall off significantly. Detail became scarcer and scarcer until the line work became almost a caricature of itself. Looking at Asa from the first chapter to one later shows the significant difference in Fujimoto's level of detail. Now, it's not abnormal for mangaka to alter their style as they release their work. For example, Hirohiko Araki is well known for significantly altering his style of drawing even within discrete parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But something about this change Fujimoto made didn't feel like the progress of artistic ability, as Araki drew Diamond is Unbreakable, but rather as a degradation of workmanship. Fujimoto was getting sloppy through his drawings and the way he was writing. It was clear that he was losing interest in the manga he was creating. Fans of the manga, who read it as it came out, oftentimes attributed this to fatigue Fujimoto may have experienced. Any issues were dismissed out of hand, often citing Part 1 as proof that Fujimoto had a plan for where Part 2 would go, then pointing to the one sterling, shining, beautiful example that Part 2 actually had, the relationship between Denji and Asa, which never really faltered in quality to a significant degree. And through the rough parts, many people clung to this one plot, the love story of this girl failure and this boy failure, and held on hope that this was the way that Fujimoto was going to write himself out of the hole that he's dug. The hole being the primary plot of Part 2, which comprised of a prophecy in which the Death Devil was going to descend upon the world and kill everybody, only for this to be undercut by the fact that the Death Devil was already present in disguise as a different character, and that the Death Devil didn't want to kill everybody, and in fact wanted to just cease to exist so everybody could live in harmony and peace or whatever. Coupled with a bunch of character deaths that didn't feel particularly impactful or just kind of cruel without any greater narrative weight, and the fact that Denji seemed to keep regressing back to an earlier state of development rather than moving forward like he did in the first part, this led the lead up to the grand finale feel like it was built out of a tangle of unresolved plot threads. This culminated in the erasure of the concept of death, literally, which led to the battle between Yoru and Denji over the fate of the world and Asa's mortal soul. It was going places, but it still felt like it needed something to wrap everything up. And I, along with many other people, expected another 20 or so chapters to find out where the story would end up. And the bugs showed up. Turns out, when nothing can die, bugs can just breed forever and consume all organic material on the planet. As a result, the fear of bugs spiked heavily, and all the bug-related devils became unfathomably strong. In the middle of the final battle between Denji and Yoru, all the bug devils showed up, and it looked like the final confrontation was going to be against the forces of entropy itself. Yoru and Denji will have to put aside their differences and work together to fight these seemingly impossible odds. It was ridiculous, but just crazy enough that everyone thought Fujimoto could pull it off. And then they both got off-screened by the bug monsters. We didn't even get to see the fight. Instead, we simply find Denji waking up in a strange dreamlike field where Pochita, his dog, who died and fused with him at the beginning of the series, was there to greet him and functionally says, "You were better off at the beginning of the manga when you suffered like a little bitch." And then he proceeds to rip out his own heart and say, "I'm going to myself now, themes and such." And then at the very bottom of the last page of that chapter are the most harrowing words that I have ever read. Final chapter next week. What the fuck? The final chapter opens at the very beginning of the manga. Like literally the first chapter of part 1. But this time there is no chainsaw dog and Denji is just a random kid. He goes to where the Yakuza kill him and his dog, and everything plays out exactly the same, except he isn't saved by Pochita fusing with him. He's instead saved by one of the main characters from part 1 who had died very dramatically. She revives him and is essentially made into her manservant. They're both conscripted, much like part 1, into the Department of Public Safety to hunt devils. After killing a devil on the grounds of a school that Asa is herself going to, she saves her from falling down, at which point, maybe the most infamous single page of this entire manga was put to ink, in which Asa turns to Denji and says, "Thank you, Chainsaw Man." To which Denji says, "Huh?" And she says, "Yeah, because you're a man holding a chainsaw." This particular page was memed to the high heavens after the release of this chapter. You know, the final chapter. Instead of celebrating the completion of this would-be masterpiece, we instead get ridicule. The entire internet knows that Chainsaw Man is done, and that the ending blew ass. It didn't die quietly, it died with a resounding whoopee cushion fart. More than feeling let down, or angry, or confused, I felt embarrassed. This manga and its show I have been recommending to people for years, singing its praises, telling them to go out of their way to seek it out, and it just threw a pie into my face. When Game of Thrones ended, there were a lot of people that you could blame. George R.R. Martin for failing to write the books in a timely fashion, the showrunners for mishandling every aspect of the final 2 seasons, the writers for not picking up the slack where the books left off, or even the entire industry for inflating Game of Thrones' budget. But Chainsaw Man was made by one guy, Tatsuki Fujimoto. He alone decided that he was going to simply give up, just throw his hands up in the air and say, "I don't want to write this manga anymore, go fuck yourself." In his 2 one-shots before the beginning of the publication of part 2, you could see that Fujimoto was exploring the ideas of losing the love for art and how he found endings difficult, and showed a desire to simply torch whatever ending he was required to write. But I would never have expected for him to actually follow through on one of those ideas in a manga as popular and beloved as Chainsaw Man. Throughout this video, I have been advocating against the type of doomsaying that can be found within any community that experiences something coming to an end. That it's an unhealthy way to experience art in such a maelstrom of negativity. And it will only ever lead to a greater unhappiness. To be suffused with anxiety is a terrible way to go about your life. But I'm a hypocrite. I can't practice what I preach. Chainsaw Man meant something to me, and now in place of that meaning is an ache that I would wish upon no one. And it has undone any healing that I have achieved after the disappointment of Game of Thrones. It's hard to rebuff the doomsayers when you agree with them. Shit sucks. The end. Hey everybody. There was a lot of negativity. I know I don't normally make a bunch of negative videos on my channel, and I don't hope to make a whole lot of them, but I had a boiling within my soul that I needed to kind of puke out in a lot of ways. Thank you for, I'm out of breath. It's fine, I'll get it a second. Thank you for reaching the end. Thank you for watching, and thank you for getting to the end of the video. If you liked it, why not leave it a like? And if you really liked it, why not subscribe? And if you really like my inane rambling, why not become a channel member? It helps me get equipment like the lighting setup that I got for this video. I have a teleprompter now specifically because of the support that some of you have given me. And if you'd give me a moment, I'd like to thank these lovely channel members. Special thanks to Warlock, BU176, Zero from Drakengard 3, Breadloaf, Finkeldink, and Shrike of Steel. Thank you all so much. I really do appreciate the support. And hey, I've got more ideas planned, and I've obviously have a setup to film myself now, and I have a method of generating B-roll, which is significantly easier on my ability to edit videos. Hopefully this new style is to your liking. If not, let me know. I can make adjustments. I'm still trying to get used to the whole teleprompter thing. It's been a trial, but I hope that you enjoyed the end result. I got more stuff lined up. I always appreciate you guys watching. So I'll see you next time, and y'all have a great day.
All right.
Oh, 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 no.